Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Oh, thanks. Good morning. Well, it's great to worship with you this morning. Great to be with you and sing praises to our God. I love when these circumstances kind of happen where we have Valentine's coming up this week, and we have an interesting passage that kind of lines up with that. One thing that me and my wife have loved doing, like the last few months, is getting back into old sitcoms. So we've watched through The Office, and we got to the end of The Office, and it's like, now what? And it's like, well, your mom and dad everyone loves Raymond. Let's give that a shot. So we've been trying that, and the last episode we watched was a flashback episode about Raymond's wedding and Raymond's proposal. And the age-old question in the episode is, why did Deborah marry Raymond? And why, in his mind, he thinks he looks like a pelican if he's turning sideways. He said he had a good front shot, but not really good side shot. Why would a beautiful woman like her marry a pelican? So the episode goes on, and he's so excited at the beginning. He's engaged, he's pumped. And then Raymond is such a pessimist and such a realist that he can't believe that she would marry him. And then he starts badgering her. Is it the ring? You just like the ring so much. It's so big. That's what it is, right? And she's like, no, it's you. And then it moves on to the wedding and wedding planning. And she's like, I did this since I was 12, planning this stuff. And he's like, this is it. It's the wedding. It's not me. It's the wedding. And you just see him like crumbling his own engagement before your eyes. So our text today is going to kind of talk about themes like that, about disappointment and about weddings. So we're going to be in John chapter 2, if you can open up there in your Bibles or on your phones. And we'll be walking through this text today. And what our main point is that we're going to see is that Jesus brings an abundant new age into our lacking world. Jesus brings an abundant new age into our lacking world. And then we'll see this over 4 points. We'll see a great celebration, a great problem. We will see the greater age and the greater glory. So we'll be walking through that today. And so let's start today in verse 1 in chapter 2. On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. And Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. All right, so last week, Dale walked through the first week of Jesus' ministry. And what we pulled out of that was that as Jesus kicked off his new ministry, it corresponded to the first week of creation. So the first week of creation is corresponded to Jesus' first week of ministry. And what we see is Jesus is new creation. He's restarting the creation week. And the creation week, the first one, comes to its climax with a wedding. A wedding. So this narrative in John comes to its climax with a wedding in John. And so what John wants us to remember is the first wedding. The first wedding. And what God set up. So we are a culture that is confused about weddings. We think weddings are traditions. It's just a human tradition, things people made up along the way. And weddings can be tampered with and adjusted to go along with the times because it's a tradition. And just like any tradition, you need to update it along the way. But what we're going to see here in the first week of creation, is that weddings are interwoven to the fabric of creation. That weddings are a part of God's blessing to the world. So God makes Adam, and it sees that it's not good for him to be alone, puts him to sleep, and makes Eve out of his rib. And he wakes up, and he responds to seeing this beautiful woman in front of him, and he responds in song form and sings the first love song. So you can let me know how you think about this. He sings this song. He says, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man." All right, so we got some guys at the men's retreat, and so I need some help. I need help twice from the ladies today. So good poem, bad poem, nothing, no judgments. I got a little bit of this. All right, a little bit of this. I mean, it's the first poem written by a man ever. So he's trying. He's got no model to go off of. He just kind of blurted it out. So, yeah, maybe a 5. 5 out of 10, average. But you can see here that the wedding relationship is interwoven into creation. And this is a good gift because weddings show us something about the nature of God. Now, our God is triune, which means there is unity and distinction. So unity, there's one triune God. There's one God. But God the Father is distinct from God the Son, and God the Son is distinct from God the Spirit. There's distinction and unity. And the same thing in a marriage. There is distinction from the partners, but there is also a unity. And that's why Moses gives us this verse. He says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and not ashamed." So this is a good gift from God. It's a good goal for men, single men and single women, to pursue marriage. Now, the goal of relationships it shows that it's not dating. The goal of relationships are marriage. And this gets pressure and pushback from our society where we have this new thing called adultolescence, which means you push off marriage until you're way older, out of your 20s. And if you get married in your 20s, you're absolutely foolish. Now, some Christians get married older, some get married younger, but I wanted to say this morning, that the Bible shows marriage as a good thing. And it's a good thing to get married young. It is not foolish. It pursues a good thing. And if you're a young Christian guy, if you're an adult, and a young Christian girl, and you're an adult, and the shoe fits, the factors fit, you guys are both pursuing the Lord. You're in relationships within a local church, a Christian community, and you're all displaying fruits of the Spirit. If the shoe fits, put it on. Pursue marriage. It's a good thing. It's a good thing. And I'm encouraged, there's several young people in this congregation that aren't listening to the world, listening to the message of adultolescence, but they're pursuing marriage, and that's a good thing for us to pursue. So Jesus goes along with this invitation. He goes to a wedding, and he got weddings. He got that it was woven into the fabric of creation. He enjoyed weddings. He enjoyed going to them. And in Jesus' day, weddings were super important, and especially in Jewish culture. They could last as long as a week. And if it was a very rich family, the whole town could be invited. So the weddings were put on by the grooms, not by the bride's family, the groom's family, and they would invite people. And if you were a rich person, you might invite the whole town. So you might have to invite people that you don't like, and they don't like you. But back then, it was a social faux pas to not invite them and not for them not to accept it. So at a wedding, there's people who probably don't like you. And that's what's dealing with this context. And weddings were so important that you could get out of the Jewish religious festivals if you were a part of a wedding, because it was considered not just the unity of two families, but a sacred thing. So with this high social expectation comes the great problem. The great problem. Pick up in verse 3. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." "What has this concern of yours to do with me, woman?" Jesus asked. "My hour has not yet come." Okay, so this is a big problem. They have no wine. This wedding just turned into a Christian college. It is dry. Dry. And this is a problem because wine is super important at a wedding, and especially at a wedding. More than any other celebration, wine is very important at a wedding. And their wine is different than ours. It's not as strong. It's watered down, usually 3 parts water, 1 part wine. So the alcoholic content is anywhere between 1 and 4. It's not like the wine we have today. So you have to kind of get that in your mind. But this is a big deal that they ran out. It's such a big deal that the bride's family could sue the groom's family for not having enough wine. So this is a big problem. And Mary joins team hostess with the mostess. She wants to help solve this problem. So she goes to her eldest baby, her boy, to help get some help from this. And you could see how this situation, especially the lawsuit part of it, could cause a serious case of bridezilla. But haven't we experienced this sort of lacking lately as Americans? I mean, you can go to the grocery store and there's not any eggs, or there's not enough milk, or the shores are empty and there's no peanut butter. Or if there finally is eggs, and you go to the eggs, and it's $2 more than it was last week. And there's been lacking in our society, this sense of not having enough, a sense of money doesn't stretch as much as it used to. We've been experiencing this lacking. And with Jesus, Jesus has a plan to address our lacking and their lacking. So let's find out what he does. He says his hour is the solution to the problem. Now, before we dive into the hour, I want to talk about his interaction with his mom. So he uses the word woman, which comes off in English as very demeaning and rude. It sounds like a video game 20-year-old boy locked in his room yelling at his mom, "Leave me alone. I don't want to deal with that." That's kind of what it sounds like. It's pejorative. It sounds rude. But that's not how the term is used in Greek and in Jesus' vocabulary. The term woman has either just kind of a neutral connotation, like the word ma'am, or it can mean a lot of affection. And it shows that on the cross. Jesus says to his mom on the cross, he says, "Woman, behold your son." So he points to the beloved disciple and says to the beloved disciple, "Behold your mother." So Jesus, he knew he was dying, he was going to leave, and he set up provision for his mom using the same phrase here. So this is a word that can have a lot of tenderness and affection in it. So he's not being disrespectful, but there is a sense of disengagement. Jesus is kind of pushing away from his mom's concern. His mom cares about this wedding. She probably cares about the groom. She probably cares about their family. She's trying to help. Honestly, she reminds me a lot of my mom just in this situation. My mom's a big party planner, extroverted girl, and there are standards to parties. Like there is meat and there is starch and there better be a green salad. There are standards, and you better meet those standards. So she's trying to keep up with the standards of the time, and Jesus, what does that got to do with me? He's kind of getting some distance about it. So what is he thinking about? He says the word, "My hour hasn't come." What is he talking about? What is he thinking about? So this word hour occurs 15 times in the gospel, and it is about executing God's redemptive plan on earth. So it starts at the cross for Jesus and everything forward. So the hour, his hour that he's talking about is his crucifixion, his burial, his resurrection, his glorification, his ascension, his return, his defeat of Satan. And lastly, the last thing is his wedding. Jesus has his wedding on his mind. He's at a wedding, and he's not thinking about that wedding. He's thinking about his own wedding. So where does that pop up in Scripture? Well, Revelation 19, verses 6 through 9 tells us, "Then I heard what seems to be the voice of a great multitude, like the roar of many waters, like the sound of mighty peals of thunder, crying out. So this is God's people, they're gathered together and they're crying out. And just as like an aside here, like would our worship sound like that? Sound like thunder? Shake the room a little bit. Would we be like who we're going to be in the future, where worship is so all-encompassing, it just rattles the room. And we don't just airmail it in, but we give God the praise he's due. All right, so that's an aside. That's a different sermon, but let's keep going. All right. They say, hallelujah, for the Lord our God, the Almighty reigns. Let us rejoice and exult and give him the glory. For the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. And it was granted to her to clothe herself with fine linen, bright and pure. For the fine linen is the righteous deeds of the saints. And the angel said to me, write this, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. So he's got the marriage supper on his mind. That's what he's thinking about. He's thinking about his marriage in the future. Now, I talked about marriage and its plan here and now and the goodness of it. But there is some people who God might be calling to singleness, where they would be like Jesus, that their marriage isn't here on earth, but their marriage is with Christ, and they've been called to be single for their lives, that they would await the wedding to come just like Christ. And just like Christ, it is not a demeaning thing to be single or be called to singleness. You know, some people say that I have to get married to whoever I want in order to feel fulfilled, in order to feel like not half a person, in order to feel fully human. And I'm telling you that Jesus never married on earth, and he was fully human. He was the model of humanity. He was perfectly human. So you don't have to get married in this side of heaven in order to have a full experience of what it means to be human and have a full, fulfilled life. Otherwise, if you believe that, you're saying something about Jesus' life. So his statement, my hour has not yet come. So he's thinking about his wedding. And this doesn't mean he won't act. He doesn't have an inability to act here. He's just saying, I can't bring the full wedding supper that's coming. I haven't gone to the cross yet. That hasn't happened yet. That's what he's saying. But that doesn't mean he's not going to do anything. And his mom knows this. So picking up in verse 5, his mom says, his mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. Okay, so in the Greek, it's in there. The way she says it, she's expecting something. She's expecting that something's going to happen. She doesn't know what it is, but she has faith that Jesus is going to do something. Her eldest boy is going to do something and address the problem. Pick up in verse 6. Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. So what are these water jars? Well, these jars are not clay. So they didn't make a jar and then put it in the fire and then harden it. These are stone. And these are massive, either 20 or 30 gallons. And I have a picture here if we can put it up. So this, from nice Red Wing, Minnesota, and I want to put it next to a guy so you see how big 20 gallons is. So that's a clay pot. That's been fired, and that holds about 20 gallons. Now, can you imagine what a stone one would be similar size, but they found a rock, and they put it on a lathe and spun it, and then they would drill into this thing until it could become a pot. So why would you do that? Why would you take so much trouble to make it out of a rock rather than just making out of clay? Well, the answer is, in the book of Leviticus, if a mouse or a rat or a gecko fell into your pot and died, that whole pot would become unclean. And you would have to break the thing. And you can imagine how sad you would be. You have that big, giant pot, and it's just a waste to smash it. So they made it out of stone. So these things were perma-clean. All the geckos could die into it as much as you want. You just wipe it out, you keep going. So these are what they would use to wash the hands of the guests. So they would pour it out over your hands to wash, or they would pull it out on the utensils for the wedding. And these represent the old covenant's requirement for purification. So the idea is to stand in God's presence, you need to be clean. To stand even amongst God's people, you need to be clean because God is holy and there's nothing about death or nothing about this world that can be near to him. But Jesus is the definition of clean. He's contagious clean. He touches things and they become clean. And that's who he is. And he says this in John 15, verses 3 through 4b. He says, you are clean because of the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me and I in you. So Jesus makes you clean. If you are connected to him, he cleanses you to able to be around God's people and be able to be in God's presence. So that's what Jesus does. He makes us clean. Now these jars are now useless. Useless for purification if Jesus fulfills them. So they are going to be filled with the wine of the new age. Pick up in verse 7. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water, and they filled them to the brim. And he said to them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast. So they took it. So just 3 simple commands. Fill, draw, take. 3 simple commands to the servants. The servants don't question, they just do it. And because they have this simple obedience, they get to see this sign, this miracle of God. Pick it up in verse 9. When the master of the feast tasted the water, now become wine, and didn't know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, everyone serves the good wine first, and when the people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now. Okay, so who's the master of the feast? The master of the feast is a guest at the party. So he's either a relative or a friend of the groom. And so it's men's retreat, so I need another help from the ladies. Who's ever been a personal attendant before? A little bit, yep. So personal attendant, I always feel bad for the personal attendant, personally. I'm not, I don't make checklists for fun. Checklists are for work. And so the idea that, you're a friend, you're my friend. You're not as good of a friend to sit in the wedding party, but here's a big to-do list. I just feel sad about it. So that's what I think about the master of the feast. I feel like that's kind of what he got stuck with. All the commentaries are like, this is a position of honor. And I'm like, is it really? Or you just say that because that's what socially you say. Anyway, my thoughts. But that's his job in the wedding, to oversee the feast. And he says something culturally here. He says something that they would say in the culture about serving the good wine first, getting people drunk, and then serving the bad wine. Now, this is what you call in the Bible descriptive and not prescriptive. This is a description of this one guy and what he said. Because the Bible's accurate. It talks about bad things that sometimes people say. So this guy said this thing. It's not a prescription. It's not saying go do this. It's not that at all. It's a part of the narrative. And, the Bible is just really clear about drunkenness. Ephesians 5:18 says, do not get drunk, for that is debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit. And Jesus likewise in Luke 21:34 says, watch out for drunkenness. Watch out for not being ready for my return with drunkenness. So as Christians, as we think about alcohol, we need to be wise about it, and especially if you've had some sort of addiction in the past, or if you are tempted with getting drunk, maybe God's calling you to abstain from alcohol. Alcohol is not sinful to drink, but it is sin to get drunk, and maybe that's what God might be calling you to, maybe not. Another thing to factor in with a Christian's use of alcohol is your family history. To think through, do I have alcoholism in my family history? Is that something in my past? And then weigh weigh that in the balance and make a good decision based off those things. So this guy says this thing, and it's kind of shows the sham nature of the world. He says, let's get these people drunk and then serve them the bad wine. And it just shows you, like the last passage talked about like things lacking, running out. And then this kind of shows you the sham nature of the world, tricking people, deceitfulness. And that kind of shows up a lot in our world where, things aren't as good as they seem. Even like really like good things. Like last week, me and my family went to the Mall of America, and it was so fun. We went on the log chute like 3 times, and they haven't changed it since I was 5. Everything else has changed, but the log chute, it's still the same. But after the 3rd time, the animatron, like Paul Bunyan, doing that, it's just not as scary or as like impactful as the first time. And you start to like see that, man, this is fun, this is good, but I can't stay here. Like I can't just live and do this all day. Like this doesn't have substance. Like this is hollow. And that comes with other things in life too. Like you get a hold of something and it just becomes like hollow. And I see this with retirement, with like retirement packets. It's like, here's the 401k packet or the IRA, and it's like 2 couples or like a couple just having the best time, and they retired early, and look at us. But then, I talk to people like Dean Indebritzen, who is the former interim pastor here. I think he said this about retirement. He said, retirement is a slow descent into obscurity. Lots to look forward to. And that's how my dad reports about it too, that it was like he retired, and it's kind of like, oh, what do I do now? Like as soon as he got a hold of it, it just wasn't what he thought. It was hollow. And we see the hollowness of our world. But in this passage, we see that Jesus can bring substance into our hollow world. So we see this first by the abundance of the wine that he brings. It's 120 gallons, at least 120 gallons of wine. That's a ton. That's enough for 3 bathtubs. I don't own 3 bathtubs. A lot of you don't own 3 bathtubs. That's so much wine. This is enough wine to get them through the whole week. It's more than enough. So why does he do it? Why does he choose wine? Well, he chooses wine because there's a prophecy that comes with wine. And this prophecy was given by the prophet Isaiah. And he was talking about an age that God was going to bring in at the end of time with lavish food, overflowing wine, abundance. So let's pick that up in Isaiah 25, verse 6 and 8. On this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all the peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, of rich food full of marrow, of aged wine well refined. So he's talking about the new heavens and new earth. This mountain is the new mountain of Jerusalem. And he's talking about that it's full of good wine and good food. I don't know if you've ever had bone marrow before. It's not something very common in our diet. But if you ever get at a restaurant, especially if they serve it on little bones like this, that's when you know it's good. They mix in spices and like cranberries into the bone marrow. And it's really like fattening, but like in a good way. Like you just know that I won't need to eat for like a week after this because it's so rich. And this is the world that Isaiah is prophesying, that overflowing food, good meat, good drink. And that this is for the people of God. Isaiah continues on in verse 8. He says, he will swallow up death forever, and the Lord will wipe away tears from all faces, and the reproach of his people he will take away from all the earth, for the Lord has spoken. So in this time, it's not just, a feast for a feast. It's a feast celebrating that death is defeated, that it's swallowed up forever, that all the pain of sin and sorrow is wiped away. And if you remember, from that Revelation passage. It talks about God's people being righteous, having the righteous deeds of the saints. So God's people in this future age are completely righteous, to able to enjoy wine and enjoy all this food without sin. So my question to you is where's your hope? Amidst a world that is, the dollar doesn't buy as much as it did last year, in frustrations with, my budget cost for food has just gone out the window, or maybe it's something else. Where's your hope? Is it the next house? Is it the next job? Is it your next vacation? Is it the hope that your house would be quiet and your kids would be quiet and you would just have some peace? Or that you'd finally, the kitchen wouldn't get immediately dirty after you get done with the dishes? In that type of world, where's your hope? And is it in the things of this world or in this age to come? Abundant wine, abundant food. Is that your hope? No more crying, no more death. And maybe you're like me. I'm going to be getting chickens this spring. You can hold me to that. I said that last year and I didn't do it. So I need to do it. So chickens with laying eggs and, help me with that cost of eggs. But if you're doing that kind of stuff, you're like, are you doing it anxiously? Like, oh, I got to hoard up. I got to get all this food. I got to pack up in case all these bad things happen. Or are you doing that with just peace and knowing that I'm just going to keep moving on. This is just for a time. This is not forever. Because the truth is, if you're worried about will they experience the same prosperity that we've experienced? Will that happen? Will they have the same advantages, the same opportunities as we had? I don't know. I don't know the future. And nations rise and nations fall. And America is no different than any other nation. So the question is, where is your hope? Is it in this age to come? Is it in the kingdom of God? Is that where your hope is? All right, so we talked about the future. Let's get our feet kind of back on the ground, back into the text. So why does he do this sign? What is it for? How did it affect the people around him? Well, what it did was it showed the greater glory of Jesus. It showed who he was and caused faith to be in the disciples. So pick it up in verse 11. The first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifest his glory, and his disciples believed in him. All right, so signs in the book of John, there are 7 signs. And signs are meant to point beyond the miracle, beyond the thing, to who Jesus is. And you need to respond in faith. Otherwise, there is possible judgments for you. It's worse to see a sign and not be pointed to Jesus than not to see a sign at all. So there's 7 signs in the book of John. One is healing the official's son. The other is healing a disabled man, feeding the 5,000, and then healing the blind man. And then the raising of Lazarus, that's like the whopper of signs in the book of John. That's the muskie of miracles. It's the thing that the Pharisees are going to bite off their toes at the edge of the dock. After the raising of Lazarus, the whole book turns, and it's dead set on the death of Jesus. There's no going back after that point, after the raising of Lazarus. So maybe if you were astute, you saw the table, you're like, there was only 6 on that table. You only said 6. Way to pay attention. Good job. There is one more sign. The last sign in the book of John is going to come up next week in the next chapter. Jesus goes to the temple, and the Pharisees say, we demand a sign. Why do you do these things? We need a sign for this. And he says, destroy this temple, and I will raise it up again in 3 days. So that's the 7th sign in the book of John, is the resurrection of Christ. And this is your sign to know that this age isn't just some wistful hope. It isn't something that is just a dream. It is real. Christ is raised, never to die again. You will not find his body. You will not find his bones. He is alive right now. And that's your sign that this age is real. And he will come again to swallow up death forever and give you this abundant age. So how do you get invited to this feast? The angel said, blessed are the people invited to the wedding feast. How do you get invited? How do you get your RSVP in? It's super simple. The disciples did it in this passage. They believed. They saw the sign. They took faith in what Jesus had done. And that's your sign to respond to the resurrection of Christ, that I believe that Christ died for my sins and has rose from the grave and is sitting in heaven alive, interceding on my behalf. Now, as we close, I want you to consider two areas of faith. And it's true, you believe Christ and you get access to that mountain, to that age, to that abundant age, immediately, absolutely. But faith is also something that grows. Faith doesn't stay still. Faith grows. So 2 things I want to challenge your faith in. One is this idea of purification. What kind of old jars do you have in your mind that think, this is what makes me right before God? This is what makes me a good person. You know, I go to all my kids' sports games. I plow my neighbor's driveway. I recycle. Justification through recycling. It's very popular. I recycle. I'm not a bad person. But what things, just slightly, that you believe, this makes me right before God? Like, I'm not that bad because I do this. What's that thing? Do you really believe that every morning you get up and there's not a single thing you can do to make God love you more? Do you believe that? On the flip side of that, do you believe that when you get up in the morning, there's not a single bad thing that you can do to tear away God's love from you? God's love is constant. There's no way you can purify yourself. Christ does that. Being with Jesus does that. The second thing is, where are you finding your satisfaction? What things of the earth are you trying to grapple with? Or what's the thing in your mind that if you had it, if you really thought about it, you know that it wouldn't satisfy? What's that thing in your mind? And not that you can't pursue that thing, but how could you let go of that idol and hold on to Christ, knowing that he's the one who brings abundance into your life, that he brings joy forevermore? So with that, I'm going to call the band up to the front. And we're singing this great song called "We Will Feast in the House of Zion." And may God just increase your hope, your security, knowing that he sanctifies you and nothing else can, and your hope of this future age, and that you could let go of this lacking world.